Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Cologne. And what is now the 7th session of our Safety Week. We've had hopefully quite an interesting journey through a number of different topics and subjects, and I'll give you a bit of a summary as to what's been going on in case you missed any of the sessions in a few minutes. So for this 7th and final session, we're going to talk a little bit about what's been going on this week. And then we're really going to focus, hopefully, really practically on what kind of leadership and communication aspects of all these safety things we've been talking about you can think about during this ramp up phase, hopefully, that we're starting to see increase now. Now, one of the things that we've certainly had over the last few weeks, we've had a number of different EASA events, and we've had this safety week and other things, and we often get asked, where does all this fit together? And maybe it's worth just quickly saying about this journey that we're on. So 2 weeks ago, we had the Safe 360 conference. In Safe 360, we were very much focused on the safety issues, talking about the issues and what the solutions would be. So it's that kind of first part of our safety risk management process where we're kind of worried about, are we all worrying about the right things strategically and what are we going to do about them? And then what we've done within this safety week is we've now kind of shifted that focus much more towards the solutions side of things. So what are the challenges we're facing and how do we deal with them in a practical way? And that's really what we've kind of focused on this week. Now, it doesn't end here. And this is part then of a long-term activity that's a key part of our safety promotion strategy and activity. So in August, we're going to launch a Friday lunchtime conversation aviation webinar series. We'll do it as just kind of a short 1 hour session with 30 minutes of webinar and then questions. So even if you just want to join the kind of first 30 minutes part or join for the first hour, we'll be recording them as well so people can check them out afterwards. We know, obviously not everybody can join every week for a webinar, and we're going to pick a whole number of different interesting topics supporting the ramp up and then potentially beyond to really kind of make this part of what is ultimately a long-term safety conversation. And I think, certainly that's one of the biggest things we're trying to promote with our Together for Safety promotion initiative. It's to get us all openly talking about safety, talking about the challenges, collaborating and communicating as effectively as possible together. And we have our AirOps community site where we host lots of information. We have also a conversation aviation LinkedIn group specifically designed largely towards being a place for safety managers to come and exchange ideas and talk and share different ideas and really kind of come together for safety, which is the whole kind of idea of the brand that we're trying to do. So when it comes to this last safety week, there's quite a lot of things that have come out. So we started the week with a session on the main safety issues from the EASA perspective, from the national authorities, from the DGAC France. And then we had ACI, CANSO and IATA providing their view from kind of different domain perspectives of the safety issues and the challenges that we're facing as an industry at the moment. We then had all the different domain sessions. So we had ATOs on Tuesday morning, we had aerodromes in the afternoon, and then yesterday we had a really interesting session with training organisations and then with air operators. And this morning we had a session specifically for CAMOs, maintenance organisations. And it's interesting that despite the differences between the domains, there were some really kind of key common themes that came out of this. The first part was specifically that it was all about the safety culture, the communication, the working together, the collaboration, and that by doing that between organisations, within organisations, having that positive, open and honest kind of cultural approach, we really had the opportunity to really make a difference in our safety goals and the work that we were doing. there was a lot of discussion about skills and knowledge, and particularly that, we obviously have this huge challenge at the moment where we have people in all sorts of different situations. People who, there are people who worked throughout the pandemic who started off perhaps thinking they were running a short 100-meter sprint and found out they were actually running a great big marathon, who are really, really tired now. And at the other side, there are lots of people who've been furloughed and found themselves in difficult situations, who are now hopefully starting to come back to work and perhaps haven't been able to engage in aviation activity for such a long time. And we've got this complete spread, and appreciating where each individual that you're responsible for is in that kind of personal journey, and then how they're feeling in terms of personal attitudes, well-being, all of this kind of stuff is really, really important. And then what's really come together in this is the resilience of our safety management systems at the heart of joining not just safety in the operational sense, but people's wellness and fitness for duty. And we heard that really interestingly in the Air Ops session yesterday, particularly. And then, how you bring in all the other aspects, the health safety measures, health and safety in general, all of this, and how all of this comes together in an integrated way. Now, it was really interesting also, and I think this is why this session's particularly relevant, is that we got an awful lot of questions about those kinds of things. As a leader, how do you actually do this? It's all very nice to talk about all of these solutions, but then, ultimately you're in an organization, you have to make this stuff happen. And it's not necessarily as easy as perhaps it looks just watching a few EASA presentations, which is kind of an interesting thing. And one of the particularly key things is all of this ultimately, comes back to the definitions that we had of being ready and staying safe. So in terms of being ready, having the right tools, equipment and infrastructure in place, having enough skilled, trained and qualified people who are operationally ready and fit for duty. And this is particularly then where we start bringing the well-being in. And the other aspect of the being ready part is then putting your staff and their well-being at the heart of a people-centered ramp-up. And we're going to come back to that, particularly that what do we mean by a people-centered ramp-up when we get into the webinar series in August. And we're really interesting to explore that. And then obviously the staying safe part of the campaign is around encouraging people to follow recognized processes, procedures and practices. We heard quite a lot from the panelists that now is not necessarily the time to be trying to do new and different things, without really thinking about that. Particularly, knowing your risks, mitigating them effectively as part of a resilient management system, and then finally setting that culture of trust that encourages reporting and gets us all ultimately talking about safety. So anyway, that's my introduction, and that you've heard enough from me now, and we've got a fantastic panel that are going to, we've got some questions for, and I'm sure, we've had some discussions before this session. I think this is really going to be really interesting. So we've got, firstly, Colin Russell, who's the nominated person for compliance and safety at Lilium. Hi, Colin, welcome. We've got Diane Chadwick-Jones, who's the former director of human performance for BP. So really interesting to get a view from somebody who's outside of aviation. Hi, Diane, welcome to the session.
Hello, everybody.
Then we've got Gretchen Haskins, who's a board member for Heli Offshore and the Flight Safety Foundation.
Hi, everyone.
And then finally, we've got Mark Searle, who's the global director of safety for IATA. Hi, Mark.
Hi, everyone.
And particularly a huge thanks to Mark, who's joining us quite early in the morning from Montreal on a bank holiday. So huge thanks, Mark, particularly for your dedication on holiday as well to join us.
Pleasure. So
as we get into this discussion on safety leadership, so the first question I have, and I'm going to come to Colin first. So in terms of the practical challenges for leaders, you're obviously in a leadership position in aviation right now. What are the practical challenges you see leaders facing, and what advice can you offer to people right now about the things they can do?
I think, John, one of the biggest things for me is the amount of uncertainty that's coming in, and the constantly changing situation means that everyone feels like they're on the back foot. We're being reactive or firefighting rather than trying to get ahead of the operation and get ahead of the changes before they come. and we can always get caught and wrapped up in our firefighting. And it's very difficult to make the time to think ahead. So one of the practical tips that I've certainly used before and I'm using at the moment is very much a sort of crawl, walk, run philosophy. So what do we need to do to be able to crawl? What do we need to do to be able to walk? And what do we need to be able to do to run? Or as someone reminded me the other day, Colin, forget your crawl, walk, run. We're walk, run, sprinting. So we can already forget the crawling bit because we don't have time for that. But still that mantra of a measured approach and a measured increase. So in terms of some of the planning then, asking the teams, well, at the moment we're walking, what are you going to need in order to be able to accelerate further? What do you, if we get a further release and in terms of the increase in volumes we're going to expect, what do we need to be ready for that? So a chance to break out of that firefighting cycle and think, okay, guys, just listening to what your teams need, I think is one of the real sort of practical tips that I've seen, certainly from that firefighting and that reactive mindset.
Excellent, thanks for that, Colin. And Diane,
anyway.
Diane, you've been involved in leading teams across at a global level in outside of aviation. What about from your side? What are your thoughts?
Well, thanks, John. And I love what Colin's talking about: crawl, walk, run. In the oil industry, what we're facing is delayed major shutdowns, which are about huge amounts of maintenance happening on large sites. So imagine there's a site of 2,000 people. Each of those people has to be PCR tested. Each of those before they can even come onto the site. Then we have the spot checks. And so there's a lot about a big focus on the well-being of the workforce, the health of the workforce, and the logistics of that, as well as then, as Colin said, the quality of planning on the work. Because remember, everyone's rusty, right? The people who are doing that maintenance may not have done that particular type of isolation or that particular kind of drilling or that particular kind of scaffolding for many, many months. So we're having then to think about the capability of the people and how do we make sure that we're doing practice runs so that we're not putting people in at the deep end. So I think that's the build upon what Colin has said.
Thanks, Diane. And Gretchen, you've seen it both from an industry and a regulator's perspective. What additional kind of thoughts can you give on that one?
Well, I think the industry is really facing a challenge right now with the huge lack of resource, because financially, we're operating at about 20% of before. It's a huge drop in resources. I also see challenges with operational recency and lack of people who have been out there doing it every day and getting that practice. And then the whole thing with COVID has added a lot of change to the way we work, and it's a distraction, and it affects people's well-being. And so what can you do to combat those challenges? Well, I'd say there's 3 key things. And the first one is simple. Keep reiterating your stand for safety and for each other. We want to do this safely. We're committed to doing this safely. Safety is still our priority despite the challenges we face. And the second thing is, kind of like Colin said, it's being ruthless about priorities. Picking a few things that matter most. Each day, each week, each month, ask yourself the question, what are the things that are going to have the most opportunity to save lives here? And you're going to have to say no to some things, but do the things that matter most. Have the conversation with the front line, with the people around you about where are our priorities and what are the critical actions that help us address those. And then finally, I would say, use your resources towards those priorities, use them well, and consider the fact that some people have less to do right now. There's less operation, less traffic in some areas. There's some people on furlough. Try and look at how can you get ahead of the game with those people and their time and use them to best effect as we ramp up.
Thanks, Gretchen. I think it's one of the interesting things you're talking there, particularly about focusing on key actions, and Colin and Diane mentioned that as well. And that was one of the things I remember, Mark, when we were putting the initial part of the campaign together. We've got these lists of key actions both at an organizational level and then for different actors. And one of the kind of key uses for that is not necessarily to feel like you have to take the whole list, because there's just too much there, I think. And it's finding the ones that really apply to you and your organization, like you say, that has the greatest effect, and really selling them and saying, okay, these are the things that we want to do. And I love the message that you've all given so far there about making that stand for safety. And it's been interesting as we've been learning here in our safety promotion team more about how do we do, dare I say, more modern marketing, and getting into corporate storytelling, and just being clear about what do we really stand for, and have that clear statement. Particularly in an environment, I guess, in aviation where there's lots of very technical people, and it's easy to get lost in the detail, because actually, as engineers, potentially pilots and different technical people, we love detail. So actually, it's easy to get lost in that. And perhaps maybe if I can come to you now, Mark, obviously you've got members all over the world, and you're working globally with so many different organizations. What do you see their main challenges are, particularly from a leadership perspective, and what are the things that can help help people at an operational level in that sense?
Thanks, John. I think, the headline for me as far as the challenges are fundamentally maintaining the trust and confidence of your people, your customers, and your stakeholders. And that's really challenging because, as we've seen through the whole of the pandemic from the beginning of last year, the airline industry has been hugely stressed. And the financial pressures put on it to keep their head above water just can't be sort of excluded from the conversation. And we've got to ensure, and this has always been, I guess, a challenge in all my time working in the oil industry and in the aviation industry, that we can be quite transfixed on income generating measures, and safety doesn't generate income as a hard bottom line, and we need to sort of not forget that safety sort of is the core, the DNA that keeps us in successful business, whether it's aviation or any other industry around the world. I think it's really important that we understand how we balance demand and supply. A lot of people have been furloughed who have lost their jobs. That skill set has been reduced, and people are being brought back onto line as business returns to the market. And we need to really make sure that we can enable the supply to meet the demand, and not to have the workload falling on a smaller number of people's shoulders. I think the huge challenge is around organisations being able to interpret the ever-changing government rules and regulations. Every time there's a glimmer of light, and we start to see flights being announced and airlines advertising that they're now flying to those locations to be able to fulfill their customers' needs, it's all closed down again. So I mean, that is a huge challenge for a business, when every week there may be a different stance taken by your own government and the governments of the states which you operate to. All of this, I guess, feeds into how do you manage change effectively, and how do you understand the consequences of change within your organization in relation to your people and the wider world. And talking about your people, I mean, I think everybody, I'm most certainly feeling it, and I'm really looking forward to going on holiday in a few weeks' time. The stress and the workload and the burden to try and fathom what's going on and how we emerge from COVID is really, really, really critical. So what advice? I guess the key thing as we're doing here is that effective engagement. How do you communicate in an industry that's in a state of flux, the path that you are trying to weave out of COVID into a period of regrowth? your people, your teams within your organizations need to hear about that, because by hearing about it, they may be able to effectively contribute to that redevelopment structure within your organization. We have to really be clear that we have come across things that maybe we've never come across before. How do we learn from these pieces? Being a learning organization is absolutely critical. And when I'm talking about being a learning organization, I think we need to be really, really focused on that reporting. And from IATA's perspective, we most certainly have seen reporting drop off because of individuals' concerns about their own jobs. And also there's a little bit of I guess hero status there, where it's like, I've got to keep the show on the road, even though you may be feeling stressed or fatigued. You want to keep the show on the road. So we need to learn from these experiences and ensure that we come out of COVID that much stronger. And I think another really key point that we need to sort of focus on is, how do we future-proof our industry against events like this that will come again. That will come again, and that's really, really critical. So we need to understand what's worked well and use actually COVID as a springboard to mature our own organisations and mature our industry in the way that we approach safety. And I guess a couple of other things is, we've demonstrated over the last 18 months how essential it is to be agile. Let's keep that mindset in the way that we manage safety moving forwards. And let's never get back into a state of being comfortable about the environment we're in, because I think, I most certainly feel that, things have changed, and we need to continue to challenge ourselves to make sure that we remain fit for purpose, but also introduce a huge increase in resilience within our organisations and industry as a whole.
I think, thanks for that, Mark. I think you covered some really fantastic topics there. And one of the things I was just noting there, I think, certainly as we develop the discussion a little bit in the next half hour, 45 minutes or so, I think definitely in a little while towards the end, I think it's useful to come back to that future-proofing part. And I know, you're all involved in lots of very interesting work areas in terms of what can we do in terms of leadership moving forward as an industry, and it's a great sort of opportunity to come back to that. There's also, and we've got a couple of questions, and again we'll come back to that very shortly, is the subject of kind of integrating across teams and across organizations, and the interfaces between different people and different organizations on things. But one of the things that you covered kind of right at the start, I think might be interesting to maybe talk about a little bit, and maybe if I come first to you, Colin, is in the context of, you talked about, Mark, how balancing safety, the bottom line, and operational performance. I know, Colin, from your previous time as Director of Safety in Airlines, what kind of tips can you offer, particularly for safety managers and safety people, on how do you have that conversation within the organisation about the balance between safety and operational priorities?
It's a good question, John, and I think the bit about balancing priorities has to fall down to speaking the right language. You've got to connect with the people that you're talking to, and to help your priority become their understanding in their language. So talking about finances, for example, as a safety professional, it's no good just talking about safety and the freedom from harm or the protections. You have to put it in what it means to the person you're trying to convince or win over, in terms of pounds, shillings and pence, or euros or dollars or whatever currency you're dealing with. Or you've got to put it in terms of operational output. So an increase in operational availability, for example, if you're talking airworthiness and engineering, or more reliable departure times if you're talking to the ground team, and turnaround times. So you've got to find the language that lands with the people you're working with. Safety in its own right is a state. It's a state of being. It's not tangible, but it's the impact it has in the whole operation, be that engineering, airworthiness, ground or flight operations. That's where you win. And I think that's really important. So in terms of being able to describe safety and its impact on the operational or financial performance or business performance of the organization, safety doesn't sit in its own box in the corner somewhere. Safety is integrated into the operation. So that's got to be the hook. So you have to, as a safety professional then, or a safety leader, you have to learn the language of the different departments so that you can find out what it is that clicks with them and you can put it in that context.
Thanks, Colin. Perhaps if I turn to you, Diane, in the context of oil and gas, it must be a continual challenge is balancing that operational output with safety and all the other activities that you're trying to do as an organisation. What insights can you offer?
Thanks, John. So in any high hazard industry, there are dilemmas and trade-offs, and there are in the oil industry. And I'd like to refer to what Gretchen talked about the stand. So the key thing here is that what is our stand? Our stand, and this is not from the safety department, this is from the senior leadership of any high hazard industry company, is that we will not compromise safety for any business objective. Okay, so that's the stand. Now, then what we do is we think about, well, what Colin was talking about, which is about the practicality of that. And that's when we are talking about the culture of care and the culture of trust, because every day there are those dilemmas and those perceived trade-offs. So what the solution on those is about the open, transparent conversation. So rather than senior leaders just assuming that everything's fine, and oh well, everything's fine, we're not seeing anything going wrong, but we all know that there are those dilemmas. Instead, it's about saying, well, let's make those dilemmas more visible, because the more visible the risk is, the more conversation we can have about it, the more solutions we can come to. So rather than a person and their supervisor struggling over this dilemma, instead escalate that up. An example would be confined space entry, where the PPE of the person concerned couldn't go in to the vessel to take out the catalyst. But this was made visible rather than actually having a shell helmet, so an incomplete type of PPE where the person, it might fall off within the nitrogen filled vessel. Instead, this was escalated and saying, well, hang on, what a different way can we do this in? And rather than the leaders going, well, just get on with it or do the best you can. I mean, I think, we've all remember what that was like. Just do the best you can. Instead, it's saying, what are the different options and solutions that we have here? So in summary, we have these dilemmas, making them more visible and getting more people and different perspectives on how to fix these dilemmas then enables us to actually, for other people, communicate these dilemmas and then say, well, other people in the same situation, how do they manage that as well?
Thanks for that, Diane. I think that was a fantastic insight. And maybe come next, if we go to Gretchen, I'm sure I know this is an area that you're really passionate about. So, what thoughts have you got?
So I think the safety leadership is about conversations. And the number one thing I would encourage everybody who's on the call is to consider, what are the conversations that you could have that would make a difference for safety? And often we can have conversations about problems and issues, and everybody's stressed and there's a lot going on and it feels like just more and more problems, right? And this is a time for collaboration and joining together and partnership. So I would say, if you're going to have a conversation with someone, start first with shared objectives. And it goes back to what Diane said. We want to make sure everybody lives. That's what we're here for. And we want our business to thrive. We want to do it safely. And then to start talking about, so what are the actions we can take? And in that, I think a mindset of, does it all add up? Will the frontline people have the support they need to do their job? Will the business people have the support they need to make good decisions about where to put the resources? It comes back to what Colin said, speaking with people in their language, in partnership, about how can we jointly solve this dilemma, as Diane said. And so, I think the two perspectives are, have the conversations with whoever, your stakeholders, your staff, your colleagues, your partners. The second thing is focus on, does it all add up for the poor sod that has to do the work? And make sure that's the focus, because if it doesn't add up, you don't get safety. So, really look, does this all add up? So that's it.
Thanks for that, Gretchen. I guess this must be something that at IATA, Mark, you've got lots of organisations kind of talking about, particularly is that balance of the operational and the safety challenges. Is that I guess that's something that's happening all the time for you?
I'm interested in the question, and I guess my first thought is John, why do we have to balance safety with operational performance? It seems like one is a trade-off to the other. Okay, I mean, you're looking for a holistic approach here, where actually safety is in the DNA of the organization and is within the performance of the organization, whatever you do in the business. So why do we have to continue to have a conversation about its safety or operational performance? It's all part of the same show. And I think that's so important that we go beyond talking about safety as a priority. It needs to feed into an organization as a core value for everybody within that organization, rather than saying this sits with safety geeks in an office somewhere which I've never actually been to. And I think one of the things that I think safety leadership feeds down into is a way of developing sort of safety accountabilities where people all know that they have a responsibility. So whether you're sort of sitting in the C-suite having a board meeting, or whether you're sweeping the floor of the hangar, you all have an accountability towards safety. And that is how you are making your decisions. Okay, and I don't see why safety has to be an enabler or an inhibitor of doing business. It needs to be collaboratively brought together in a way that everybody is thinking about safety and the operation in the same breath.
Thanks for that view, and I think that's fantastic, Mark. And it's it's been part of a really interesting discussion we've been having internally in our when the collaborative groups were looking at the safety issues. It was really interesting that statement of it being a balance between safety and operations or operational output came up continually as a safety issue. But it's really interesting. I know when we were talking, we've been preparing a little bit this panel. It's been really interesting to, actually that's the change, isn't it? It's the mindset that you mentioned there of you're not balancing two things. They are inherently integral to each other. And I think this is where, it's something we've been continually trying to work on from our side. I know particularly is the wording of the safety issues. And actually, I remember, Gretchen, many years ago when we were looking at the first offshore helicopter portfolio and what we were naming the safety issues is actually, changing it from, is actually having the right positive language that looked at what was that goal you were trying to achieve. And that, I think that's a really interesting, it's a really great point. And I think, it's something I think, as we develop our communications and the more we collaborate is actually, moving forward. I think it's really interesting to see how that fits together. Now, interestingly, there's an interesting question that we've got that's kind of a practical example of one of the problems is that, in the question somebody's said they need strong arguments to convince their management that low proficiency is an issue in their airline. And the question is, can anyone, maybe if we start again, see what thoughts you've all got individually, can anyone recommend, how would they as a safety manager convince their organization about a practical problem like that? Looking in their FDM system to look for certain factors, but there's lots of, it's a practical problem. And I hear this from a lot of safety managers is how do I have that conversation within my organization about this problem I think I have? Maybe, again, if I start with you, Colin.
Sorry, proficiency is a really interesting challenge because it manifests itself in different ways. It appears in different areas. So I think the first thing to do then is to think, well, what might be the warning signs of low proficiency, or what might low proficiency lead to? So if we take the classic example of the unstable approach, particularly the unstable hand-flown approach, that's maybe a really good one to start with. So So if you think low proficiency is an issue, and obviously you believe it is because you're trying to convince your senior managers, is to perhaps then look at the FDM data to start with to see where are your trends that might be a result of low proficiency. But that's only one link. The next link then is to go and do some investigation. Even if you haven't had any significant events that would trigger an investigation, it doesn't stop you from investigating, or in some of the other language people use, a learning team. So go and try and learn why you might be seeing that trend, and involve the people who've had the events in that. So I would be reaching out either on the phone, by email, ideally in person, but that's obviously a challenge at the moment, and particularly with disparate flight crew, etc. But try and understand why you're seeing those trends, and gain some evidence, some numbers ideally, because depending on what makes your senior management in your language tick, some people are very numbers focused, some people are more stories focused. So if you can try and provide a combination of stories, i.e. the story of an event or a near miss or something that's happened in your organization, and also some of the numbers of what you've seen from your FDM data and what you've discovered from your learning or your investigation, add those together and see how that works with your management team. But it's really, low proficiency might be a cause, it might just be a contributory factor, and breaking that out to understand really what is it that's causing the problem is key.
Thanks for that, Colin. And maybe I turn to you, Diane, next for your thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I think this is one that's quite difficult to make visible. In the oil industry, there's competency frameworks, of course, just the same ways that you have in aviation. And of course, we do assessments against those, especially at the site manager or supervisory level. So we can actually see the gaps there. So that's one piece of data that we have. But I would actually agree with Colin. The two strongest ways are firstly the data and secondly the stories. Now, the data, we have to be really careful about what we look at for that data, because imagine your incident investigation data. It may be that in some companies, when there are issues, it stops at the person. It stops at the person and says the person was incompetent, or they didn't follow the procedure, they weren't trained on the procedure. But if you then look a bit further, you can find that it wasn't the one individual. In fact, when I kind of go and look a bit further and I go and ask in other facilities, did this same issue happen with this problem with following a procedure, I find that it's across many different sites. And that then, of course, is a competency and training and capability development issue rather than the problem of one individual. So that's why you have to be quite careful with your incident investigation data, and then really bringing it to life with stories and explaining about, especially with the near misses, and how there are systemic issues that have led to this near miss, which but just by one little barrier that actually worked, that we actually didn't have a big incident. So I think those are the two pieces. Is the data and the stories are very compelling, but be careful about the quality of your data.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Diane. And maybe turn to you, Gretchen. Any thoughts to add to
Sure,
that?
yeah. I mean, I think in order to get the data quickly, you could do a survey of the pilots or the engineers or whichever staff you're concerned about. Ask them the things they're worried about. And for some managers, that will be enough data. But to take it a step further, for some of the tasks that they're most worried about, you can go into FDM. You can look at variance on something like stabilized approaches. Are you having a wider amount of variance in performance than you had in the past? Or on engineering, I think one of the tasks that gets affected quickly is fault diagnosis. How well are people able to diagnose faults? But you can get that data on day-to-day performance relatively quickly and use it as a compelling case to get more training. And I do think it's really important at this time that we're taking action to fight for the things that our people need. And I think just doing that builds a strong safety culture.
And actually, it's interesting you mentioned, you were talking there about surveys as a great example. And actually, if I'm just going to quickly share my screen here, because we've got, we had a couple of questions about, somebody actually also asked, they couldn't find so much information for engineers particularly. And actually, this is, so if you haven't seen it before, this is our community site, and this is the campaign page. And we'll maybe Jean-Pierre, if you could post that in the chat for me.
Yeah,
so
that's exactly what I'm
you
doing.
can get it. That's fantastic. Thanks. But coming back to what you were saying there, Gretchen, actually, as you scroll down the page here, we've got then different pages with different information download packages for people in different domains. And that's where what we'll also be doing is uploading both the presentations and the recordings of the sessions we've had through the week. And actually, what you were talking there about surveys, Gretchen, in the air operators section, Pascal Kramer, who actually obviously is also part of the Flight Safety Foundation that you're a board member of, talked in his presentation about doing exactly that in Luxair. And actually, that's what they did. They did a survey of pilots to see, what phases of flight did they see the biggest challenges, and then you'll see actually be able to see in Pascal's presentation the criteria of the questions that they used for that survey. So when they ask, so if you, particularly for the person that asked that question, if you go, we'll be uploading all those tomorrow. But if you go to Pascal from Luxair's presentation, you'll see the criteria of what they asked their pilots and the things that came out in his survey. And perhaps that's a really practical kind of solution that would help you. And coming back to, as I say, for the person who was asking about engineering material, we have a whole section here of the ammo camo information. There's all the downloads, particularly of the campaign materials for maintenance organizations, etc. And then we'll upload all of the material from the session that we had this morning for camo. So there is quite a lot of information for that. And maybe, Mark, if I can then turn to you, maybe on that particular point is, if you're a safety manager trying to convince your organization about a particular challenge, what kind of advice could you offer on that one?
Thanks, John. I guess opening observation would be, I think there's a cultural issue here. I mean, strong arguments on low proficiency, and you're not able to have that conversation without it getting to a point where it's a real concern, means for me that actually there's a cultural challenge there. And actually, perhaps I've been very privileged in my flying career that when for example I was chairman of BALPA, I didn't fly very often. I had no problem asking my employer to have a Czech pilot sitting with me when I went flying, and they were very, very happy to support me with that. I know there are airlines around Europe who have now got fixed base simulators that people can now go in and practice skills when they may be feeling that they need to focus on a certain thing. So I think we're seeing a lot of organizations being very, very supportive to ensure that proficiency from an individual's perspective, where people feel that they're uncomfortable about their own performance, that they can go and practice that. So I think, from a organizational perspective, there shouldn't be, and it's going back to that safety versus operational performance thing. If there's an issue there, why is it so darn difficult to raise it through the management structure so that something can be done about it? When you're looking at perhaps some strong arguments, I mean, I think a lot of it's been said already. Have you got KPIs, SPIs that indicate that you've got a trend going in the wrong direction with efficiency? I mean, if you've got evidence there that there is a decline, I mean, that is really powerful. We've had a lot of conversations around unstable approaches within IATA. We've published a safety notice on it, and we're going to be updating that very, very soon because of the conversations we've had with IATA members, where there are so many different perspectives on this that we want to put all of that in and get something that is going to have purchase with operators around the world, which is really important from our association's perspective. So the two things for me is let's make sure that they don't need to have difficult conversations or strong arguments, that it naturally is something that can be flying from a safety department, from an operation environment, to get that support from the management to do something about it.
Thanks for that, Mark. And actually what you were saying there, I was talking about Pascal's presentation from Luxair, but actually also Solveig Ragnarsdottir from Iceland Air in the Air Ops session yesterday afternoon talked about exactly that, what you were saying about the fixed base simulators they have at Keflavik that enables the flight crew to do exactly that, is identify where they've got skills, the things that they would like to practice. They have that opportunity to do that. And similarly also the ability, as you said, and we had that actually from all three airlines that we had on the Air Ops panel yesterday, talking about exactly that, is that if a pilot wants to have another a check pilot or whatever instructor helping them on the coming on the flight deck with them to support them, then that's being encouraged. And again, Pascal talked about an example where for example, for them, flights into London City is a challenge, and that you wouldn't fly it, that you can't fly into London City until you've done a flight before, and actually done a flight perhaps with another pilot and who's monitored you, and then you can fly into London City the following day while all of that is still fresh in your mind, because particularly if you haven't flown. So it's kind of it's interesting to see, and particularly what you were talking there about the cultural aspects, about how do you have those conversations. And I think that's something particularly we're looking to follow up in the webinar series, is to get some strategic leaders from airlines and maintenance organizations at airports, etc., talking about how they do that within their own organizations to help others kind of follow on in that sense. So I'm going to kind of move the subject on slightly, and we had quite a lot of questions on how in these challenging times, as a leader in an organization of any kind, what kind of tips there would be you would have for motivating your staff. And I realized we'd said at the start we were going to go in alphabetical order, but I realized that always means that Mark mops up at the end at last. So I'm going to come in reverse order this time, and maybe Mark, if I come to you first to say, in terms of during this crisis, and what tips would you give any leader for motivating teams of operational staff during this crisis?
I believe that most people who have had limited work or no work over the last X number of months are finding themselves in a very challenging situation. But at the same time, they want to get back to work. I really believe that we have a depth of professionalism within aviation where people actually want to get back, support their operation in returning to the times of 2019 and before. So I think if you wanted to sort of split it down to motivating those people who are at work and those people aren't at work, I think you're looking at perhaps different approaches. Those people who are currently furloughed, and what I would say from an IATA perspective is that we've seen people dealing with this very differently. We've seen some operators who have actually been very, very focused on ensuring that every one of their operational staff is continually kept in the loop, and so they may only be flying once a month, for example, from pilots and cabin crew, but they are still flying. And then you've got others where they've decided they're going to keep on a core amount of workers, and others are going to be furloughed. So I mean, motivating people, I think it's about the business, how you as an individual can support the business to keep on its feet and to emerge from the crisis effectively. And I think if you're looking at it as well from a perspective of how do we, and again coming back to, I guess, a point I made at the beginning, how do we continue to keep that trust and confidence in our people, our customers, and our other stakeholders, and to get people to think about it. Don't just solutionize in a small group. You've got experts across multiple fields within your organization. Use them when they're not doing their day job as much as they would like to be doing, because I'm sure they have other skills that would very much contribute to ensuring that emergence from COVID can be more successful and more effective, because you're doing it together and collectively.
Yeah, I think that's some really good points. And maybe Gretchen, can come to you on the same point.
Sure. Yeah, some practical tips for engaging people. I'd say the first thing is be yourself, be human. Don't try and pretend everything's perfect. It's a challenging situation and you don't have to know all the answers. That's the first thing. Be human, be yourself. The second thing is, and Diane, I'm stealing this from Fuzzy, which I think it's some of the best things I've ever heard. It's really simple. Listen and act. Listen to what people say to you or their concerns. And if you're a leader, you're in a position to help them take action, or if you can't, help them act. Be in a position where something can happen from the concerns that are raised. And I know that you can't go around and listen to every single person and act on every single thing they say. So create frameworks, surveys, or ways of having better listening to the people around you. And also action plans, strategies where you talk about priorities and you act on the things that matter most. And so then you can at least prioritize and try and use your time wisely. But I'd say, be human, listen and act.
Thanks for that, Gretchen. And it's interesting, actually, we've seen, over the last few months, we've been doing a lot more of these events from an EASA perspective. And it's been interesting where, we've had, quite a few operational people now who've raised questions in events, then seen that appear on the EASA website as something we've then worked on, who've then come back sort of as oh my goodness, I can't believe you listened to what I said to you in a comment. It was even, we had one where it was a question that we didn't get to, but they then saw the question they'd answered, and we went back to them and said, this is what we've done, thanks for that. And like you say, it's being visible with your changes and the things the actions that you can take, however small they are. Maybe Diane, I come to you. I know this is an area you're really passionate about.
Well, just following on from what you said, that feedback loop is so motivating to people, because they wonder, well, what is the point in me speaking up about this if then nothing is going to happen about it? But what I wanted to do when talking about this particular question was to take what Gretchen said about be yourself and amplify that. Okay. And because I think being yourself, well, what's the one thing that is most helpful when we ask people to be themselves? The most helpful thing is to show vulnerability. Okay, and I know that Gretchen touched on that, to say that I don't know all the answers, but in the oil industry, that is happening an enormous amount with senior leaders. And I've got one from yesterday from a large oil company that isn't BP, where an executive vice president gave a town hall and talked about how, and this is again in the context of starting up. Okay, so we're all having problems with starting up operations again. And there was a particular issue with a startup of a large piece of equipment, which led to the overheating of the equipment. And this executive vice president said, well, I thought, this is somebody's fault and they didn't follow the procedure properly. And then the executive vice president said, well, hang on, wait a second. I know that it's easy to jump to blame. I know that the reason why things don't go to plan is because there's many different components of the system. And we need to change the way that we ask questions. And fortunately, in the incident investigation, the questions that were asked was, was this run outside of the design? Was there a design problem? Are our procedures good enough quality? Did people receive the right training? Did management ask the right questions? And so then this executive vice president said, I got it wrong, and I have to understand that the actions on the day, they didn't occur in a vacuum, and they have to be seen in a much broader context, and that people were between a rock and a hard place, like we were talking about some of the dilemmas. So I think this piece around vulnerability, when we're talking about being yourself and not having all the answers, but vulnerability about saying, well, I've got it wrong in the past. So that means, and I'm going to talk about Mark now. Mark, your question about how we become a learning organization, okay? That is how leaders respond to bad news makes all the difference to whether we have a learning organization or not. And that is the point that I will end on for this segment.
Thanks for that, Diana. It's great that all of these points are really linking together. And maybe at the end, finally, if I come to you, Colin, on that one.
Yeah, so one of the, I just want to pick up on something that Mark talked about this dilemma, it's safety or operational performance. I think one of the ways we can help with that is to stop talking about safety, but to talk about safe operations. Because ultimately, that's the output of the business is safe operations. It's not operations and safety, it's safe operations. So if we start to change our own language, we will help others start to recognize, and we'll start to reduce this separation and therefore this challenge between safety or operations. It's safe operations. Sorry, just one point that was sticking in my mind a bit, but I think to come back to the key question, and how we can help leaders and care for people and motivate our staff, I think there's a couple of bits. And I love what Gretchen was saying and then what Diane added on about sort of being human, being vulnerable, listening and acting. But I think the sum up behind that actually is about caring about the people that you're working with. Care is something that we all love to be cared for. And if we're cared for, then we feel more confident in what it is we're doing. So as a practical tip, when you're engaging with your team, not to ask what are you doing, but to ask how are you doing as the opening question. How are you? Not what are you doing or what's your priority or straight into that work conversation, but a couple of minutes of how are things going? How are you? Just, and then pause and wait for them to respond, because if you show an interest in them, they will then show an interest in what's important to you. And by doing that, they will take an interest in your stand, to come back to the point we were talking about earlier on about a stand or what you see as your values. So if you have your stand or your why, if you care about your team, they will care about your stand. And it becomes self-fulfilling. And then you feed back to what it is you're doing about what it is they've told you. And that reinforces that care because it demonstrates you're caring about them and the work they're doing. So that care to me really is key. And the other bit is then to focus and simplify, not to try and overload people, and to be vulnerable and say, look, you're really busy. I'm really busy. I'm struggling with this. I talk to my team about some of my own struggles, what I'm struggling to prioritize, when I'm struggling to get a task done, because it shows that I'm just, we're all the same. We're all human ultimately. And just as another practical tip that can perhaps help get into that, well, how do I ask that question? How are you? A fantastic leader I once worked with very closely, he said to me, Colin, once a month, I want you to arrange, and this is routine business, this is pre sort of COVID crisis type stuff. He said, once a month, I just want to sit down and have lunch with some of the various people that sit in the organization I work with. So the organization was 1,000 strong. He said, I don't want it to be managed and organized and rosters. I just want to sit down with my lunch, my sandwiches that I bring in from home, and I want them to bring in their sandwiches. So it wasn't a big arranged thing, but they just sat around a table in his office and they just chatted for 45 minutes. And he opened up with a question, how are you? And the feedback, the intelligence, the learning that we gained about what was actually happening in the business, because it took out all the paperwork, the slide decks, the bureaucracy, etc., the filtering that happens, and it just allowed that connection. So that care was very ably demonstrated from the leader all the way through to the workforce. And it's something that stuck with me ever since. So I think the key points there is, if you care about your team, they'll care about what's important to you, and try and find ways to bridge the different layers in an organization so that care and that understanding gets all the way through.
Thanks, Michael.
I think maybe that wraps up a few of everyone's bits.
That was a really nice kind of bringing things together, and it's funny what you were saying there about you were all talking about the kind of being yourself and finding your own way of doing things. I remember as a young manager many years ago, fairly new to being a leader. I was kind of seeing all these very amazing people that were around me and trying to implement all these different things that I was seeing. And I remember a very old, bold chap pulled me to one side one day and said, you will never be a leader like that person over there, and you will never fill their shoes, but it looks to me like you have much smaller feet. And the message was, don't lead like them and them and them and the hybrid mix of all the people you see. Lead the way you would lead. Do it as a personal thing for yourself. And I say, I've had hundreds of lessons from lots of amazing people over the years, but that's one that kind of really sticks in my mind is learning, trying to figure out what works for you, how you can create that human connection. And I love particularly what you were saying there, how you managed to bring all of that together. You did a much better job than I would at kind of pulling all of those different points together. And I think, moving forward, what I'm going to do now is kind of integrate some of the discussion we were going to continue to have with some of the questions we've had. And certainly one of the next bits we were going to move on to talk about is about communication and strategies for engaging people. And actually, there's a question. Colin knows Stephen Van Houweling, and we work quite closely together on some projects. And Stephen, as I said, we've seen throughout the course of the week different domains with their own safety issues. And question to all of you. I'll start with you, Colin, on this one. Is how do you see the combination of those issues across the domains influencing each other, and then coming together, with the resulting coordinated issues and solutions? And what advice could you give about managing those kind of integrations? I guess firstly between domains and activities, and I know something we've talked about in a lot of cases is then from the top to the bottom of the organization as well is kind of an added challenge.
Yeah, so I think to simplify this, what we're talking about is boundaries. We talk about domains, but we're talking about thinking outside of your own part of the organization or your own part of the team. One of the words I use an awful lot is tribes. People tend to naturally trust their tribe and not trust anyone outside of their tribe. So one of the things, if I take two examples, a single department in a single function in an organization, in an airline, for example, can't exist on its own and can't manage all the risks that are impacting it, because we have to share and understand what's coming in, what's going out from our area to other areas. You then can scale that to any level. And I love the work that Heli Offshore does, because what they've done is they've broken down those interfaces even between competitors. And that's something that doesn't really happen in other parts of aviation. But that's where the interfaces of this risk here isn't going to manifest itself in this area. It's going to appear as a big problem in someone else's area. So how do you share and learn? And part of it comes back to this point we made previously about language and being able to talk other people's language. So if I'm talking about reliability in one area or quality in another area, actually the impact is a safety issue in someone else's area. We take design through to production, through to operations. That's exactly what happens. It's a hidden risk, let's call it, and then it moves on to other areas, and it ultimately appears as an operational impact. And even if you come back, there are a couple of other comments talking about insect infestations in airspeed indicators and so on in flight data systems. Then absolutely, that's a good example of where risk is moving from one area, the maintenance and the care and protection of aircraft and storage, all the way through to the risk manifesting itself in flight operations when you have unreliable airspeed. And how we share and understand that learning back and forwards is absolutely vital. So to come back to Stephen's real key question is, how do the combination of those issues influence each other and the resulting issues? It's only by understanding and sharing. So if you have something that's impacting you, you need to share it outside. And you need to ask and be willing to receive it. When someone says, I've got a problem, you need to be ready to think, well, how can I play a part in fixing that problem? Or how might something that I'm doing be causing that problem?
And I think it's interesting, actually, we've got another question from Andrew, who's talking specifically in the context of static blockages, and that it's something that we've seen happen in many different places. But then, it's about how do we share that information, as you were talking about there, Colin. I think, it's a great example where, the collaboration that we're all doing as organisations. Gretchen, Heli Offshore, you were really pioneering this between so many organizations, as Colin says, that we're competitors, and sharing that information. We see it, in the collaborations we're doing, with IATA, with ACI, with CANSO, with, so many other organizations in the kind of fixed wing commercial kind of airline space as well, and as trying to do it in as many domains as possible, is to take that knowledge and share it as widely as possible. And perhaps, Diane, if I can come to you next on that kind of point about sharing in oil and gas. I guess I know there's so many broad activities. How do you bring those together and lead together as one organisation with such a diverse range of activities?
Well, we are very fortunate that there is no competition on safety, of course, which means that there are so many technical groups on specific issues. Especially, for example, around design of equipment and design of plant. There is a lot of commonality which sits under the industry associations, but there's also benchmarking groups that are set up which are from the main oil companies, who do talk about the very specific issues where we have repeat incidents. So, but where I would like to go with this is to talk more about the common standards that are agreed amongst the oil companies. For example, human performance principles. You know, that for example, people make mistakes, but typically it's due to underlying systems and conditions. You know, blame fixes nothing. You know, those actually set or have a massive impact on the culture of each oil company. And each oil company share these human performance principles, and to some extent they also share the same safety leadership principles around care and speak up. And this has been caused by a decade of the large oil industry companies actually speaking with each other, obviously under competition law rules, and that's really important, and there's lawyers there and everything, but that we're actually having a common approach. Why? Because, and this is the point here, it's a very important point, is that our suppliers that work for all the oil companies work for all the oil companies, which means why on earth should somebody who works for Exxon works for Baker Hughes, which is a supplier, go to Exxon and have one set of processes for doing something, and the next day go to BP and it be totally different, and the next day go to Chevron, it be different, the next day go to Conoco and it be different. And so there's been a huge amount of harmonization in terms of standards and of culture in the oil industry, so that people who the massive number of contractors that the oil industry has, so BP has, let's just say 70,000 people, but then it has 200,000 people working as contractors. So there has to be that commonality of approach, so that the people who do those maintenance work for us, for example, that they don't get confused when they go from company to company. So maybe that's a kind of a unique thing for the oil industry, but it's definitely something that the oil industry has been going after for about a decade now, at least.
Thanks for that, Diane. I think actually it's a nice to move perhaps to you, Gretchen, on that one. Given the work you've done already within Heli Offshore at bringing those different organisations together. I remember actually being, I can't remember which of the conferences it was, but we specifically had that discussion, didn't we, about how do we bring those interfaces together? We're not competing on safety, but how do you have those common conversations? If you know what I mean.
I've seen it all now, because Heli Offshore literally brought the helicopter world together. Fiercest competitors, regulators, suppliers, the whole lot, together working on a common goal. And the culture that they've created in learning and growing has been a real pleasure to be a part of. And it just shows it really is possible. And it takes me back to the days when I was at the CAA, and we used to have meetings as departments, the airworthiness guys, the flight ops guys, and we started changing that and having meetings as sectors. All the airline flight ops, all the helicopter, all the biz jets, or whatever. And there was people in the room that have worked at the same company for 10 years that hadn't sat together and discussed their joint risks, right? And when we came up with the significant 7, that was like 7 risks that affected us all. And we started having meetings. A stabilized approach actually is part engineering, it's part airport, it's part air traffic control, it's part aircraft design, it's part pilot operations. And all of those groups can contribute something to reducing and managing the risk of a runway excursion, for example. And there's a real power in collaboration. And I would encourage everyone to look at whoever you think is them. And especially if you're talking about them negatively, have a conversation with them, see what they care about, look for common ground, and make your us as big as you can. And, I just want to give one really practical example of this, because I saw the biggest transformation in performance. When I was at NATS, we had an issue with airspace infringements. We were very concerned about a GA aircraft getting lost and cutting the corner and hitting an inbound at Heathrow or Gatwick. And it really was a significant risk for us. And the typical way and a company like NATS would address that is to try and train the air traffic controllers to notice the infringer, or possibly give them some technology that would help them spot it easier. But we decided to look at what would it take to ensure that an infringer never caused a midair collision. And we said, basically, you need to do a couple of things well. The best thing is if the pilot can plan not to fly there in the first place, and they can plan well. The second thing is they can navigate effectively and they know where they are and they don't get lost. The third thing is the pilot and the controller can spot the infringer before it happens, spot the transgression into controlled airspace. And the fourth thing is resolve. So this was put into operational language. It was a big tent. It was the things that the front line need to achieve: plan, navigate, detect, resolve. And then we could brainstorm and look at, how do we make this happen? And I can tell you, things changed completely. We ended up with the avoid system that gives pilots a warning of controlled airspace. Sky Demon came out of some of this, which is a great planning tool for GA aircraft. The London Lars service at Farnborough, which is a ATC operation looking outside controlled airspace. And we also got some better tools for the controllers, by the way. But all of those things created a 70% improvement, reduction in risk on our infringement incidents. In the past, we were getting like 7% a year. And, so the power of thinking about it from the front line, does it all add up? And having the biggest us possible is really something to leverage.
Thanks so much. You touched some really fantastic points. Actually, I was thinking as you were talking there about these kind of the problems and then bringing everybody together on the same problem. And actually, it was interesting when we started building the ramp up campaign. That was kind of the part of the problem we were trying to solve, is that we know we'd seen there were a number of airlines that talked about they were seeing a problem that ultimately it was happening to them, but particularly in this case, they were talking about unstabilized approaches, and actually, it was really that shared problem, and that we needed to have discussions with controllers about their view on that, and particularly controllers providing pilots with shortcuts that was causing many of these unstable approaches. And ultimately, that was one of the goals of the campaign, is that what we've got on the NTM side matches then what we've got on the pilot side, and trying to get as many people around on one page. And I think, in fact, I saw there was a comment also from Ansgar from ACI about particularly some of the challenges at an airport perspective. And I never forget one of the things that stuck in my mind when we first started our collaborative analysis groups was John Hampshire from Heathrow Airport at the time showed me a presentation he had about chocking and coning of aircraft if you were a ground handler from one company. And there were, I can't remember which aircraft type it was, but depending on all the different airlines that you had, that you were handling, there was something like 36 different ways of chocking and coning a 737, for example. And how do we solve those kinds of challenges? And that, collaboration, I think, many of us, there's a lot of, we talked to a lot of people. In fact, we had it at the Save 360 conference a couple of years ago. Is the loot and stack project solution, where they find one common process, and it's all the organisations looking for a common shared solution, solving that solution. Now, of course, the challenge is how do you make something like that go global? And maybe that's the perfect time to come to you on this one, Mark. As the organisation, bringing so many people together at a global level. I guess this is something that you're living and breathing every minute of the day.
Yeah, John, absolutely. I mean, IATA represents 290 airlines around the world. With the IOSA registry, that's close to 500 airlines that we have a physical relationship with on a day basis, and that means that we need, as been indicated by the other panelists, it needs to ensure that we engender collective thinking and ensure that we're focused on core goals that mean something to us all. And you know, we've spent a lot of time over the last 18 months, despite the chaos that COVID has created, is ensuring that you know, through our board of governors, we have a clear strategic priority on safety, and that's about you know, reducing the all accident rate in aviation over a 5-year rolling period. And we are monitoring that, and we're accountable to that, and our members are really keen, and the rest of industry is really keen that we continue to drive down that rate. And to put all that together, you know, I'm really pleased that we have a new safety strategy with around 3 pillars of leadership, risk, and connect, to make sure that we're really focused on that collective thinking and ensuring that we're all sort of pointing in the same direction. And it was a bit of a concept, I guess, about a year plus ago of having a COVID-19 safety risk management framework, because IATA don't own any risks, but we want to make sure that those risks are shared and understood and addressed across the whole of industry. And I'm really delighted how industry has seen this as a really clear vessel, which can be accessed through IATA.org, by the way. Of you know, okay, I'm seeing that I'm changing my operation. For example, a great one over the last 12 months is the use of passenger aircraft for cargo transportation, and the various challenges that created, and risks perhaps from passenger operators that they had never considered before. But the framework actually has the experience and the knowledge from others already doing that work. And so you don't need to start from ground zero. You know, we're providing generic safety risk assessments, and generic is really, really key, because, you know, individual organizations need to do their own thinking and manage their own risks. You can't just sort of pull something off the shelf and say, right, job done. And hopefully that within an organization that would never happen. Although I have to say that when we've been working on the state safety programs, you know, we have seen quite a few organisations providing an off-the-shelf state risk profile, which really doesn't really show, you know, how SMS feeds into our daily lives. So at the macro level, I think we're doing well, okay, and we have fantastic information within our advisory councils, within our safety group, that shows that collective thinking really does point us in those areas that we need to prioritise and focus on over a period. I think at the macro level, as far as individual organisations, at this point in time, it's actually quite challenging. You know, that collective thinking, breaking down barriers is absolutely essential. There is only one organisation, and I'm really delighted that our new Director General, Willie Walsh, has made it really, really clear that there is only one IATA, not a number of divisions that operate individually. And why that, you know, is a little bit challenging at the moment is a lot of people feel that their jobs are at risk. So, you know, if they can show that they have, you know, a little bit of the organisation which they solely own, then maybe they feel a little bit more secure. And going back, I guess, to the earlier conversation about, you know, making sure that we are motivating and engaging with our people, we need to break down those myths that actually by holding a piece of a jigsaw puzzle will secure your job. You're probably more likely to secure your job if that idea, that knowledge is shared across a whole organisation. And a particular example of this would be, you know, we've just set up a new division around environment and sustainability, which is absolutely critical for the future of aviation. Okay, and I'm delighted how, you know, the people within the environmental department realise, because we speak to them, that there are unintended consequences in safety. You know, steeper approach paths, you know, acceleration altitudes that are different than have previously been proposed. You know, single engine taxis, blah, 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 blah. You know, understanding that there are consequences and putting the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together, as Gretchen said, you know, was the way that things were developed within the CAA, is really, really critical. And people not feeling afraid of sharing and learning together.
Fantastic. And again, there were so many fantastic points in there that kind of really helped to bring this discussion together. And I realised we've got sort of 10 minutes left now, and I'm going to just cover off a couple of short bits on questions, and then if I'll come from Mark backwards, then through you all in a second, just to give me a few words on kind of leadership for the future. And I know you're all involved in various different activities for the future that are really interesting in this area. So I'll come to you for some kind of final thoughts on that in a second. But just in terms of a couple of questions, so we've got one from Belinda who says, does standardization across an industry give a risk of groupthink and as a result mean safety improvements might be missed? And I know certainly from our side at EASA, we've, particularly with our Data for Safety project, but there are all sorts of other activities where, by trying to kind of view the it comes back to what we're talking about, viewing problems from different angles in a coordinated way, whilst also making the best use of different technologies and things to find to look at the problem in different ways and find these different solutions, kind of to avoid that kind of thing. So I thought it was worth just particularly commenting on the fact that our Data for Safety project was really very much designed around mitigating that challenge that Belinda asked in her question there.
Yeah, and John, can I just add that that's in the oil industry, that's how we've done it as well, as we've looked at all the pools of major incidents and then done our process safety fundamentals framework, which is shared across the oil industry based on the data. So looking at the things that are the highest risks. Now, the point that Belinda's saying is, well, you do that, will you miss the small things, or will things move over time? And my answer is yes. So we keep on looking at the data to see if things are moving, because there's no momentum on safety. We keep on having to improve because the world around us keeps on changing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And actually, one of the things, in fact, the different organisations that I think we're all collaborating with is there's also the situation where we're collaborating with each other and looking at our own data, and not only pooling the data to collaborate on the whole data, but then comparing what we each know in our organizations with each other as well, which is ultimately very complicated, but it kind of helps to do exactly that in a coordinated way, which is great. And I know there was another question from Cengiz talking again, it kind of follows on this discussion we were talking at the beginning about culture, and he says the risks. What are the risks that pilots, engineers, ATCOs are tolerating for a leader? Is a leader going to ask, what are the risks that my staff are tolerating and putting up with in my organisation and coping with and dealing with? And that he said he's never seen a leader kind of ask those questions openly, and maybe that's kind of a nice lead in then to the kind of future question. And say, if I come to you, Mark, is in terms of moving forward, certainly from one of the things we've been talking about from our side is normalizing the conversation, not just in organizations but across the industry. But from your side, what are the things you see for the future? And I know you've got projects going on yourselves in the context of leadership and the future. Would you like to say a few words on that one?
Yeah, sure, John. Safety leadership for me is absolutely that seed within an organisation from which good things flow. And for me, this is very much about ensuring that when we're talking about safety leadership, it is a conversation at the board that is having the same sort of priority as ethics, diversity, and inclusion. It is a role and responsibility that I would feed into corporate governance. That is a core responsibility of industry executives. It needs to be something that we are having clear, coherent messages are understood by every layer of management through to frontline workers. There can't be any difference of interpretation. I've seen that in organisations. I've been asked by the CEO of my last airline to sort of say, why is it, Mark, that I'm expressing this at board level, but actually it's not getting through to those frontline workers? So that that clarity of the message that can't be misinterpreted, it is really, really critical. people on the front line whose reports you absolutely rely on in order to develop as a business, to develop as a safe business. We're excited that the pillar within the strategy of safety leadership has been wholeheartedly endorsed by our governance structure within IATA, and beginning to sort of roll out a number of actions. So through our safety group, we're focused on ensuring that we're drip, getting this message across the world. Now, cultures are different across the world, but actually safety leadership can have its place in each one of those organizations. And we're doing that by employing safety leadership champions across all of our offers, so that those conversations can start now. I think, what I'm excited about, and having presented it to the IATA Safety Group last week, is our desire to develop an affirmation that it's absolutely what we should do, is moving forward with a safety leadership charter, where actually there is a declaration by executives in boards that there are key principles that we are expecting our organization to follow. Okay, and again, it's around crisp clarity, can't be confused. And I'm really delighted, actually, having had conversations with the Flight Safety Foundation over the last few weeks, that we're looking to present a paper to the ICAO high-level COVID conference around safety leadership. So it's beginning to get that momentum going. And the other thing is that, we want to see, and will be actively seeking, leaders in industry to do safety talks. My first target is most certainly Willie at the top of our organization, to really highlight how safety leadership is an enabler for your business. It doesn't have to come back to, safety versus operations. Operational safety is, as Colin said, key to that. So lots of on our sort of agenda in IATA, and collaborating with others to get that message out.
Thanks for that, Mark. And actually, that's quite nicely leading into your side on that, Gretchen, because I know you're involved in a lot of the work similarly on the Flight Safety Foundation side in that area.
Yeah, and I think, aviation is one of the safest forms of transport. And one of the things that we've learned over the years to make it so is training for pilots, training for engineers, currency, etc. And why shouldn't we be doing that for safety leaders? We're at such a critical moment right now. COVID has been hard on the industry. We've lost some of our great and long-term leaders, right? And how are we going to bring the next generation on? Well, I'm delighted to say the Flight Safety Foundation is working on a project called CALM, Core Knowledge for Aviation Leaders and Managers. And they're working in partnership with people like IATA and anyone who wants to, really. And we want to really create a movement and a framework that starts to say, here's what good looks like for aviation training and for safety leaders particularly. And that means we can give people support, not just expectation, so that they can get their job done.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Gretchen. And it's great to see all these collaborative activities, in so many areas coming together, but particularly now around safety leadership. There's so many good conversations to have, and hopefully a lot of people to help and support. At this, it's like a pivotal moment in the industry. Is that we look with great hope to the future to be able to really set things up long term that that are really have this firm foundation for the long term. Maybe Dan,
I should have said, John, sorry, I should have said, if people are interested in finding out more about this, I'm sure if they follow the Flight Safety Foundation and probably also the IATA on LinkedIn, more will be published and there will be opportunities. This is meant to be something that is shared and developed with the industry, so we get the best result possible.
And I think that's one of the great things as well, is there's so much good information really starting to to be much easier to find for so many people in key places. We've got our community site, from our side of Together for Safety, the Flight Safety Foundation have this great hub. IATA, other key organisations. pooling the information that really helps people either across the industry or in, similarly with ACI and Canto and others, within their domains as well. Maybe Diane, if I can come to you for some final thoughts.
Yeah, so I would like to talk about a key enabler of safety leadership, and this is about what I'd like to see more of in the future, and that is, and this fits with Cengiz Turkoglu's question, which is, let's make sure that we build capability in people to understand that there is a big difference every day between work as we think it's being carried out and work as it's actually carried out. Okay, we know, let's not assume that there's perfect procedures, perfect weather, perfect equipment, perfect training. Let's not assume that. Let's assume that in fact there's lots of changes and that things change over time, and those bring those hidden risks. So then we got that understanding, then what do we do? Well, we do those questions, the questions that Cengiz is talking about. What's making the work difficult? What would you tell somebody who's doing this for the first time? What would you tell them to, the things that could trip you up? What are the kind of problems that have happened in the past? These are, rather than just asking, well, what's theoretically the risk? Let's talk about the difficulties of the work. And in fact, in BP, we've been taking senior leaders from other companies and going to our sites and actually training them up on this and showing them this. Because, yes, Cengiz, it is a can of worms, but we'd much rather know about it than not know about it.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Diane. And maybe finally, Colin, if I come to you for your last thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I love all the points, and particularly Diane's point there about the work as imagined, work as done, the real world rather than the world we see from our computer monitor, etc. But I think the other bit is, we talk about safety leaders, they should do this, they should do that. But actually, I also worry about the safety leaders and care for them, because they're in a great position, but quite a stressful position too, in trying to hold things together, having the accountability and the responsibility. So my first plea to the safety leaders, and by that I mean the safe operational leaders as well as the safety professionals, is to pause and catch your breath, because it's been a hell of a time, and actually, if you're burnt out, then you can't help influence positively the safety performance of the teams you're working with. So pause and catch your breath, and then I guess the next bit then is to find time to ask and listen. Find time to ask and listen, be it ask and listen about what people need or how they are, or ask and listen about the work as imagined versus work as done, as Diane has just said. So really, and to ask and listen in a simple language. One of the things we get really caught up in is jargon, and I'm a real believer in keeping the language simple. As I mentioned, talk about it in other people's language that they can relate to rather than your own. So I guess that sort of sums up and wraps up a little bit of the so what of this whole session, perhaps, is to think of how the safety leaders that we're working with can make a difference, can get stuck into the problems, can learn about the problems that they need to get stuck into, and actually start to slowly, every day, just get a little bit better and a little bit better. There are no golden bullets or silver bullets out there that are going to fix all our problems. But by pausing, catching our breath, making sure we're okay, making sure those around us are okay, and then we can start to make all the changes and all the great stuff we've been talking about in this session. So that's, I suppose, that would be how I would think. But it's about speaking simply and caring about others. If we do that, then I think a lot of the safety challenges that we're talking about are all addressable.
Wow, Colin, I have to say, it's funny because I'd made my notes as to how I wanted to finish that session. And if I'd have tried to plan a handover for my very last thoughts, actually, I couldn't have set that up any better if I'd tried. And the big thing, we've been talking a lot throughout the whole pandemic. There's been lots of discussion about well-being and the people element to this. And some of you might remember I did a small talk at the EASA safety conference back in October last year, particularly about this idea of, like we have in a safety demonstration, put your own mask on before helping others. And exactly that is it comes back to, I remember when we did the original wellbeing guide right at the start of the pandemic with the Flight Safety Foundation, IATA, and various other groups that were involved, is that idea of how am I coping, how am I feeling, and what can I do for myself and others, and bringing that compassionate element together. And that leads really nicely then to probably the biggest question that people ask when we talk about this ramp up campaign is that's really at the heart of this people centered ramp up that we talk about, is that it's as much about, you know, having those conversations with people about safe operations. And I really, we talked about that quite a lot during this session. I think that's really important, and then being clear in our actions. And I think, you know, we've had a fantastic discussion today, and kind of going to finish it there now. We've run over the time a little bit, but I think, you know, it was a really important to bring that discussion together. And thank you to all of the panelists for your great insight and your great thoughts. And hopefully, you know, I know certainly from a lot of the comments we've had already, you know, we've covered some really important points, and hopefully, you know, this isn't something Safety Week finishes here and we all go on and do something else, but this is just the start of that long-term, or not the start, a continuation of that long-term conversation that we have as an industry. So thanks to the panelists, thanks to all of the people that stuck around for the full 90 minutes. We'll put the recording up on the community site tomorrow, and yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to everybody who took part and supported this Safety Week from our side, our colleagues in the building, particularly thanks to Jean-Pierre here, who's been, I'm going to put, there he is on the camera, who's supported us throughout the week and been my wingman here. So thanks to JP and to everybody involved.
It was a fantastic week, and if you have a question or if you want to access the presentation or recording, just put for everyone where to, the hyperlinks where to access the resources for this fantastic Safety Week. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you very much. And if you want something to keep you chuckling for the afternoon, think about me trying to figure out how to dismantle this wall behind me. It is literally some crazy concertina structure that in about 5 minutes we'll be wrestling with in this room here. So thanks to everybody. Huge thanks again to the panelists.
Big thanks.
Take care, and yeah, stay safe and have a good summer. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Take care, all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.